Chapter 24, The Civil Rights Movement in Modern Georgia. We're going to begin with an excerpt of a poem from Langston Hughes. Pearl Harbor put Jim Crow on the run. That crow can't fight for democracy and be the same old crow he used to be. I want you to come prepared to class tomorrow to talk about what this means. That's how we'll start off. The civil rights reform that we're going to talk about during this time period, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, came from both the government and people, mostly in three ways. First, courts struck down segregation laws, those Jim Crow laws. Second, presidents and Congress supported new laws guaranteeing equality in voting rights, and ordinary citizens, black and white, used nonviolent protests to encourage changes. We're going to talk about all three of these. Let's start with the presidents and the courts. And we'll begin right after World War II. After serving in the military with honor during World War II, African Americans were no longer willing to settle for a second-class status. They felt like if they had been willing to fight and die for their country, that they should be treated equally when they came home. In 1948, Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ordering the immediate desegregation of the armed forces. We'll talk about how this would affect the civil rights movement in Georgia. In the very first section, he says, there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. This policy shall be put into effect as rapidly as possible. So, fairly quickly, all military bases were integrated. The definition of integration, bringing together people of different racial or ethnic groups as equals. In the South, this meant that bases like Fort Benning were integrated while surrounding towns like Columbus were not. So from 48 on, Fort Benning was integrated. Throughout the 50s, schools there were integrated, movie theaters, but when African American soldiers came into Columbus, they still faced a very segregated community. Southern Democrats in Congress who were opposed to civil rights formed a new political party, well, the Southern Rights Party. They called themselves the Dixiecrats. And they're going to be important in politics for the next several years. Let's move on to court cases. In Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the courts began to rule against the Jim Crow laws. Before Brown. One of the cases before Brown was a Georgia case, 1946, King v. Chapman. The U.S. Court of Appeals upheld the ruling that Georgia's white primary was unconstitutional. Remember, one of the things that the Democratic Party did in the early part of the century was make their political primary whites only. Well, the Supreme Court ruled that they couldn't do that. That suit was brought by Primus King, a Columbus barber and minister. Just last week, a historical marker was put up to commemorate this. In 1954, the Brown decision by the U.S. Supreme Court declared separate but equal was inherently unconstitutional. In this, the court overruled the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case. In 1955, the next part of it, Brown 2 is what it's called, said schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed. That was 1955. And just for your information, Muskogee County schools integrated in the fall of 1971. So we're going to explore how what happened between 1955 when the court said schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed and most Southern schools desegregating by 1971. The white response to Brown was massive resistance. In 1953, Georgia voters approved a constitutional amendment to prevent school integration. In 1956, Southern congressmen, the Dixiecrats, wrote the Southern Manifesto, attacking the Brown decision as unconstitutional and an attack on states' rights. In Georgia, in 1956, in response to the Brown decision, Georgia legislators changed the state flag from the 1920 to 56 flag to include the Confederate battle flag. Now, it was later eventually changed in 2004, first to this and then fairly quickly to our current Georgia flag. In 1957, President Eisenhower uses federal troops to protect black students attending Little Rock Central High School. So he uses federal troops to enforce that Brown decision. Earlier, well, between 1948 and 1971, Georgia governors Talmadge, Vandiver, Sanders, and Maddox insist that desegregation will never occur in Georgia. In 1955, we've got the refounding of the Ku Klux Klan. We'll take a look again at the modern Klan history in the New Georgia Encyclopedia. Most Georgians were not that extreme that they were going to join the Klan, but many did, or most white Georgians were not that extreme, but many did fear change. They had grown up with the Jim Crow system and thought that it was the way things were supposed to be. Some whites, mostly religious leaders, spoke out against segregation. One was Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, head of Hebrew Benevolent Congregation. It was bombed in 1958 because he had been speaking out against segregation. It really shocked the community of Atlanta. They thought of themselves as very progressive and as the city too busy to hate. And the idea that someone would plant a bomb in a place of worship was shocking. One of the quotes from Mayor Hartsfield is, "Those who practice rabble-rousing and demagoguery are the godfathers of cross-burners and dynamiters." We'll talk about what a demagogue is, and we'll talk about exactly what he means in this quote. The desegregation of Atlanta schools occurred before most schools in Georgia. In 1959, a federal court orders Atlanta to desegregate its public schools. Atlanta business leaders did not want to defy the Supreme Court because it would be bad for Atlanta's image. In 1960, Governor Vandiver appoints a committee to study integration in Georgia. It's called the Sibley Commission. What they found was that urban leaders were opposed to school closure, but lots of white Georgians were in favor of closing schools rather than integrating them. So the Sibley Commission recommended leaving the issue up to local school boards. So if you leave it up to local school boards in Georgia at the time, most local school boards were going to just decide that integration was not something they wanted to fool with in their school systems. In 1961, though, Atlanta desegregated with very few problems, led by Mayor Hartsfield. The University of Georgia was desegregated in 1961. Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter were the first two African Americans admitted to UGA. We will take a little time in class and read some of the New Georgia Encyclopedia article, and we'll learn a little bit more about their efforts. And that is it for this section of notes.